So hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Nicole. I'm from Old Firehouse Books. And I'm so excited and so grateful to Old Town Yoga for partnering with us for this event to celebrate Lucy Greaves and Curious Poses. As soon as I saw the book, I was like, I have to email Old Town Yoga. I think they could do this. So I'm super glad that they said yes and that they partnered with us for this event. So we're very excited. Lucy is here today with Andrea Bilderback, who is from Old Town Yoga, and she'll be interviewing Lucy for us. Just a few quick things before we get started. I just want to remind people that if you have not purchased the book, you can do so. It is on our website, which is just oldfirehousebooks.com. I will throw a link in the chat as well. So if you have not yet purchased Curious Poses, you can do so. I will say it's not officially out yet, but we have been allowed to sell it in advance of its release date for this event. So if you buy it now, you get a little sneak preview of Curious Poses. So yes, oldfirehousebooks.com is the place to go to purchase that. All right, I think that's all of my housekeeping. Let me just do a brief introduction and then I'll get out of the way because you're here to see Lucy and Andrea, not me. So here we go. Lucy Greaves is a writer and a yoga teacher. In addition to her regular studio classes and workshops, she leads Yoga for Writers residential retreats for the Arvon Foundation. She writes on yoga and meditation for Planet Mindful magazine. Her previous books include The Naked Jape, and she is joining us all the way from, I was going to say sunny old England, but I'm sure it's raining there.
It is pitch dark. It's pitch dark and raining, but thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Joining Lucy today is Andrea Bilderback, a seeker and practitioner of holistic health and wellness, who has been practicing yoga since 2002 and teaching since 2008. She genuinely believes that curiosity is what makes life worth living, and she considers it a tremendous honor to have the opportunity to teach the Northern Colorado community at events such as I'm going to say this wrong, Hanuman Festival in Boulder and the Sustainable Living Fair in Fort Collins. Andrea, thank you so much for agreeing to interview for us.
Of course, I am quite excited, as you can tell from the bio that Nicole just read. The title of the book, of course, being Curious Poses, drew me to it immediately. And I feel honored to have a chance just to talk with Lucy a little bit on a somewhat informal level about a piece that I know has had hours and hours and hours of her efforts put into it to produce this piece of art, literally and figuratively, for us. So thank you so much, Nicole.
Yeah.
So I'll turn it kind of over to Lucy because I think that to hear her written words read to us would be really, really lovely. And she's actually going to share some of the illustrations, but just to have an idea of the beauty of this book is really key. But throughout the book, Lucy has a way of weaving a very fundamental principle of stirham and sukham into the writing and into the yoga practice, and just kind of highlighting that. And so it's a recurring theme in it, and that's something that I know is very important to us here at Old Town Yoga Studios, to create that kind of balance in the practice. And so without further ado, I would love for Lucy to kind of share some of those illustrations, and we'll just kind of kick it off with a bit of an excerpt of reading from her.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see if it's working. Yeah. So I wanted to start with a little extract from the introduction, just to give you a flavour of what the book's about, and then a couple of poses from the book, which is a book about 30 popular yoga poses and the stories they tell. So here goes. Did you ever catch yourself halfway through a yoga session thinking, well, this is odd? The first time it happened to me was during an outdoor yoga class about 15 years ago. About a minute into a seated forward bend, I noticed that a tiny spider, the size of a pinhead, had started building a web between my calf muscle and my thigh. And in a moment of one-pointed concentration that really ought to have been blissfully yogic, all I could think was what a very strange thing I was doing, sitting on a rectangle of rubber with my body arranged in a specific and decidedly awkward set of angles for a specific and seemingly interminable period of time, while a spider treated me like an interesting new tree stump. It was a bit like that feeling you get when you repeat a word so many times that it stops making sense. These shapes I had made with my body, probably hundreds of times over the course of each year, appeared suddenly in a new and baffling light. What was it really for, this arrangement of limbs? And why teach it like this and not like that? Compared to the postures we assume in, say, a Pilates or a HIIT class, the purpose of which we could describe as exercise or body conditioning, the shapes of yoga asana feel loaded with symbolism. And in many ways, the physical practice of yoga is more like a form of dance, a language of gestures that obliquely reveal their meaning. The foundation level of that meaning is encoded in the postures themselves. Each of these special shapes is an exaggerated piece of body language, reaching nobly towards the sky, balancing elegantly on one foot, folding deeply into a stylized bow. These are whole body gestures that we instinctively understand to express a particular mood or emotion. Next, the Sanskrit names of these postures point to a deep, rich layer of symbolic meaning. The names are sometimes drawn from Hindu scripture and mythology, sometimes inspired by animals, birds, and plants, and sometimes by man-made objects like a gate or a bow. And over the course of centuries, the different branches and schools of yoga have woven in their own interpretations until each asana is clothed in a delicately complex fabric of philosophy and symbolism. For a long time now, yoga has also been an international affair. As the writer and documentary filmmaker Geeta Mehta puts it, at its best, the culture of India is like a massive sponge, absorbing everything, while purists shake their heads in despair. During the first half of the 20th century in particular, the physical practice of yoga underwent a period of rapid modernization in India, as a result of which whole chunks of Indian classical dance, military fitness drills, and Swedish gymnastics were folded into the postural canon. And as yoga has slowly grown to be one of India's most significant cultural exports, each new generation of international yoga devotees has added a pattern of its own to the practices it either inherited, copied, or stole, depending on who's telling the story. And finally, there's you. Each time you move into your crow or your lotus, you bring a new meaning to it. Deepening the pose doesn't always mean tucking your foot behind your ear or straightening your standing leg. Sometimes it means unfolding a few layers of meaning and allowing your own expression of the pose to blossom. Sun salutation, Surya Namaskar. The sun salutation that forms the basic scaffolding of the Ashtanga Vinyasa school of yoga is one of the most curious of poses. You may sometimes find yourself wondering, as I have done, whether you're in fact engaged in a very fancy sort of burpee. Stretch up, hands to the ground, jump back, do a press up, jump forward, stretch up, but make it yoga. And if so, you might have hit upon an interesting knot in the tangled history of yoga and gymnastics. Because it's almost certain that the family resemblance between Surya Namaskar and the burpee is not just coincidence. The great Hatha yoga modernizers of the first half of the 20th century, chiefly Krishnamacharya, developed their practice with reference to a range of influences from both European and Indian physical culture. So the fast-moving sequences that Krishnamacharya pioneered at Mysore in the 1930s were clearly understood at the time as an innovation, and one that borrowed heavily from forms of gymnastics and bodybuilding that were popular in India at the time. And so much so that at least one of Krishnamacharya's contemporary critics accused him of promoting circus skills rather than yoga. But to identify the rich stew of cultural influences that helped to shape Surya Namaskar, is in no way to diminish its mysterious power and beauty. It wouldn't be the basic backbeat of, at a guess, half of all global yoga classes if it didn't move us deeply, scratch some kind of itch that our bodies have to stretch and move together. To flow through a dynamic yoga sequence as part of a group with shared purpose is an uncanny experience. Like a flock of starlings or a shoal of anchovies, each body is attuned to its neighbors. Moods and impulses can split across the group without warning. And sometimes this group energy feels like solidarity, and sometimes like competition. It can be expansive and exhilarating, can carry you through a tough practice that you would easily have given up on if you were attempting it alone. But it can also drown out your interoceptive voice and take you beyond your safe physical limits. Likewise, compulsive repetition of sun salutations can be immensely soothing and can also open the door to repetitive strain injuries. The group dynamic is a relatively recent innovation in yoga practice, which for the previous 1500 years or so had always been a rather solitary pursuit. So I think it's interesting to compare how your sun salutations feel when you're alone in the room. It's a bit like exchanging the collective discipline of orchestral music for the looser explorations of jazz. Following that metaphor, you might like to experiment with tempo. How insanely slowly can you move through the sequence? Or go andante, each movement strolling smoothly into the next with no pauses. Or maybe even linger in one shape for the equivalent of a self-indulgent 10-minute drum solo. So I'll do one more and then Andrea and I can have a chat. So I'm going to read some extracts from Mountain Pose, Tadasana. Along the northernmost border of present-day India, the great peaks of the Himalayas stand with their heads in the clouds, birthing sacred rivers. According to Hindu mythology, these peaks are mere foothills to a great golden mountain that forms the axis of the world. Mount Meru stretches down into the ground as far as it reaches up into the heavens. Mountain Pose, Tadasana, evokes this mighty axis, standing tall, balanced between grounding into the earth and reaching into the sky. The yogin in Mountain Pose embodies sthira and sukha, the twin qualities of strength and softness that are at the heart of the practice. The Mountain Pose invites us to speculate on how it might feel to be a mountain, immense, patient, immovable, counting time in millennia. There is no dividing line where earth stops and mountain begins, just ground that gradually becomes uplands that merge into foothills. To be a mountain is to be part of the physical fabric of the earth, yet intimately acquainted with the sky, made of clay, but reaching for heaven. The notion that yoga poses should be a balance between opposing forces finds its most succinct and poetic form in the text attributed to the sage Patanjali, which is usually referred to in English as the Yoga Sutras. Sthira Sukhasasanam, that's the entirety of Sutra 246, and arguably the most influential 3 words in modern postural yoga. In translation, the seat, the asana, should be firm and comfortable, or perhaps strong and sweet, or even stable and easy. Sanskrit's very flexible. The mountain pose is about seeking that perfect equilibrium between reaching up and grounding down, where both forms of striving dissolve into simply standing, simply being. The point where effort and surrender, sthira and sukha, become a third thing, not what you're doing, but what is. It's not about me as mountain, or even what mountain means to me, but rather about reaching far enough down into the dirt and up into the ether, that in the end, the fact of the mountain is enough. Here we go.
Thank you for that, Lucy. So I will be asking Lucy to do one more reading for us. And I think she'll be all right with this because she mentions, and I believe this is in hero pose, Lucy, that you mentioned that you like to start your practice with hero pose. And you also like to put it in at the end of your session to almost bookend the practice. and to see how your experience has shifted or changed a bit over the course of that particular yoga session. And so I would like to bookend our time together with another reading for you to do for us at the end. But let's dive on in and get to know you a little bit better, and just the path to write this book. So in your yoga, in your experience with yoga, what got you into this practice of yoga?
So I think mine is a fairly typical kind of mid-90s yoga origin story. So a kind of hipster gym in a railway arch in East London. I was on I think the second of several eventually successful attempts to quit smoking. I was, kind of having a mid-20s London life. And I joined this gym, and they had yoga classes, and I went along. And I think it just sort of pulled me in very slowly. And then I met a guy at the place where I worked who taught Ashtanga classes in the basement, and he was a great teacher. And I like you, I'm a naturally curious person. So I was always that annoying student who had questions after class. But I was very lucky to find teachers who were willing to humor me and kind of answer some of the questions and wonder with me about the ones that didn't have answers. And then eventually I decided that I started teacher training like a lot of people do, not necessarily with a view to it becoming my career, but more because drop-in yoga classes aren't a great place to get those questions answered, really. And it's not anybody's fault. It just isn't, there isn't the space. So doing a teacher training was a way to really kind of dig into some of that stuff I was interested in, the philosophy, the history, the whole kind of spectrum. And I was very lucky to find a teacher and a very kind of in-depth 500-hour course in London. And somebody asked me quite recently, like, what's the one thing you would tell your younger self at the beginning of your yoga journey? What do you wish you could go back and tell them now? And I thought about it very hard. And what I told her was, you're doing yoga because you think it's got all the answers, and it doesn't, but it will help you ask better questions. So that's where I am now. A lot of these things are the questions are as open as they were right at the beginning, but I think, living with the questions is a kind of education in itself.
And you mentioned that in the book, that it is all right for you to not know the answer. In one of the sections, and forgive me for not remembering which pose that you did place that under, but you did teach on the other side of your teacher training. Yeah. And how long did you teach?
So I taught for 10 years, and I only stopped at the beginning of 2020, which turned out to be a fairly good timing, because about a month later the pandemic happened, and everybody knows what a scramble that was for yoga studios and teachers and all the rest of it. But for 10 years, I taught alongside my writing work, and I taught yoga to writers, which was really rewarding. And I loved teaching beginners. I loved kind of trying to set people off on a curious path through the practice. So no, I miss it a lot. But we human beings have a finite number of hours and a finite amount of energy, and I wanted to write this book.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So when you set out to write this book, you had many years of teaching experience under your belt, and I think that before I go too much into this book, I promised you I would probably mention to everyone that is tuning into this is that your previous books were on humor. And
that's right.
You had, yeah. And so I like that you kind of weave a bit of that kind of idea that we don't need to take ourselves so seriously into the book. But when you set out to write a book about yoga, how in the world did you determine which things to focus on, which 30 poses that you were going to put into this book?
Well, I mean, to begin with, I think one thing that has happened is that over the years of teaching, so by this point, these poses have been this sort of intimate part of my life for half of it, you know. But like I said in the introduction, you can do something so much that it sort of loses its specificness somehow. And actually, in my teaching, as I think a lot of us find, I'd been moving further and further away from a kind of classical posture-based class style. I'd been exploring quite a lot of different kinds of movement and different teachers and so on. And I felt like I almost wanted to sort of rediscover these postures through the lens of everything that I know now, and make them fresh again for myself and hopefully for other people too. And, you know, I think I had a lot of questions, you know, as we've established, I always have a lot of questions, but I had particular questions about the relationship between modern global yoga and the history and the roots of yoga, and about the ethics of teaching. And, you know, the yoga world's been rocked by a ton of gurus who've been toppled, and a lot of, you know, really bad news about yoga teaching. And so I think I was trying to find a way that I could use these postures that are what we have in common, really. I mean, whether our background is Shivananda or Iyengar or power yoga or whatever, you know, we tend to have a few postures in common at least. So they're like a real link between yogis all over the world. So I wanted to take that as the starting point, and then use those postures to kind of just gently unpack some of those questions that I had, and see if I could find new ways to look at the practice and so on. So in terms of choosing the actual list, I had a much longer list, and then
that's what I wondered. Was it 60 curious poses when you started, and then your editor said,
well,
no.
But you know, there's these ancient yoga texts that say, you know, there are 84,000 yoga postures and so on. But when you actually dig into it, there are not 84,000. They're actually, you know, there's standing up poses, there's lying down poses, there's sitting poses, twisting poses, forward bends, back bends. Do you know what I mean? There's a sort of finite number of ways you can twizzle a human body around. So I think I was struggling a bit, but then I decided I was going to structure the book sort of like a yoga class in a way. So it starts out with sitting postures, and then there's some sort of standing postures and more sort of dynamic things and inversions and so on, and then it sort of comes down again into forward bends and back bends, and then ends with shavasana. So I wanted to make it kind of feel familiar to us as a sort of way of moving through yoga. And there were a few I had to leave out, which I would have liked to do, but I feel like they had to have good stories, right? They didn't have to be particularly ancient. They didn't have to be advanced. They just had to have really good stories that I could dig into.
I see. So with that basic structure of covering a asana or shape or pose, and in it kind of covering the history of that particular shape, the story of the shape, and you do with each one you do a little bit of coaching of how one might come into the shape as well. But I appreciate that well-rounded approach of giving a little bit of a background on it, giving some information on some different lineages and their take on the shape, and just a hint of what I might call alignment, but nothing that is assuming that there's one way to do the shape, which I very much appreciate. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you appreciate that. I feel like there's a lot of yoga books out there already that tell you how to do the postures, and I'm not interested in writing another one for the reason that you say. You know, I don't think that my way of doing the postures is necessarily the best way for everybody to do them. So I like to leave that bit to teachers and their students to figure that out for their own bodies. I think yoga books that tell you how to do postures do have a really important place, and some of them are great, some of them are not so great. But I look through my bookshelf and I look at all these books and I see that they are promising answers, and quite often they're promising one asana as an answer for one problem. So I have one book which even has a therapeutic index which goes all the way through from like angina to wind, telling you for each condition these are the postures that you should do. Now, some of that may well be true, that some of those things may help some people to do some things, but I think it does such a disservice to yoga and to the postures and so on to try and slot them into that sort of black and white system where you do this posture for this thing. So what I wanted to create was a yoga book that set out the postures as invitations rather than as, you know, solutions to something. And, you know, there are postures in the book that I can't physically do, or certainly that I can't do anymore, but I don't think that really matters. You know, it's not about achieving a shape, it's about achieving a mood, you know, achieving a kind of a connection with a set of meanings that resonate with you. And you know, I was lucky that my teacher training was, for its time, very much concerned with accessibility and concerned with adapting poses to fit people rather than the other way around. But even so, I didn't want to tell people what to do. So the chapters each describe the pose, describe what it looks like, and at the end I mostly offer just a suggestion about how you might want to approach the pose to maybe unlock a new level of meaning for you. But I hope that people will take it as a kind of companion to their own practice rather than a way of doing yoga.
Yeah. And that makes my mind shift to your description as you're saying the in practice piece of that you kind of follow of Shirshasana, of headstand.
Yeah.
And this, I know you know what I'm probably going to ask you, but you know, you mentioned that this kind of idea that you could have a shape that could be a cure for something. And I just, you know, have to highlight here, I really appreciate how you state this in this section of what I've talked to Jake, the owner of the studio, about, where a yoga student can sometimes have this ideal or this drive or this obsession almost with achieving a particular pose for whatever reason, but this idea that a headstand is the ultimate inversion that can be a cure-all for all of these ailments. And, you know, if you don't mind me saying, again, you kind of weave this lighthearted nature to something that actually is quite serious. And you say, I hate to be a bore, but the human shoulder girdle and cervical vertebrae were not designed to bear the whole weight of the body. And I'm assuming this comes with some experience for you in your years of practice. So can you speak to that a bit more?
I would love to talk about headstand. So I think there's a sort of quite widespread misconception that yoga postures are intrinsically therapeutic, or that they're good. They are there because they are good for your body, and that is not what yoga is traditionally for. And a lot of these traditional postures, like a headstand, they've had these theoretical benefits attached to them over the years, which are not really in line with their original purpose. So with headstand in particular, so if you read a bunch of sort of 20th century yoga manuals, they'll tell you that it improves blood circulation to the brain, that it strengthens various muscles, that it's good for your heart, that all sorts of things, like all sorts of attempts to kind of pin down this medical reason why turning upside down might be good for you. If you look further back at the kind of tantric text, it's all to do with this kind of esoteric anatomy of the nectar, the amrita that drips down from your brain. And if you don't catch it and stop it, it gets expelled from the body as semen, or, but, you know, like it's very kind of gnarly, like ancient religious, spiritual stuff. And then you turn the body upside down so that it can't, this nectar can't drip out of your brain, it just stays there. So neither of those reasons, neither of those explanations are like super compelling for me. They don't quite do it. And I have had, teaching headstands for me is super scary because, you know, human necks are little and human heads are precious, and people do mad things in yoga classes. So I actually stopped teaching headstands very shortly after I started teaching it. And then I stopped practicing it myself some time later. And this is what I have to say about it in the book. Shall I just read the,
yes,
the offending section? I hate to be a bore, but the human shoulder girdle and cervical vertebrae were not designed to bear the whole weight of the body. There is nothing normal, natural, or indeed necessary about standing on your head. The benefits of an inversion on the circulatory and nervous systems, because there are benefits, can be achieved by any pose that puts the hips above the heart, lying down with legs up the wall, for example. And meanwhile, the recorded real risks from repeatedly trying to balance your body weight on the crown of your head include nerve damage, such as thoracic outlet syndrome, which is the compression of the nerves running from your neck to your arms, degenerative arthritis in the neck, and retinal tears due to increased pressure on the eyes. So for me, the headstand belongs firmly in the category of intrinsically pointless things that people do just because they can, like juggling or learning dothraki. There are safer and more accessible ways to get all the physical benefits of an inversion. So please practice the headstand, please do, but do it purely for the joy of doing something difficult, for the change of perspective and the overcoming of a fear, and not because of any dubious claims about its health benefits. And do it slowly, diligently, guided by a teacher, and in manageable increments. So that, I think, you know, that's as close as I come in the book to being didactic, but it's really a plea to my fellow teachers and students just to take with a bit of a pinch of salt. I think, you know, it's easy for us as teachers to kind of create an atmosphere in a yoga class where the students trust us completely, and they trust us to make their bodies stronger and better, and maybe they abdicate a little bit of responsibility and risk assessment in the process. So I think I just wanted to kind of set that all down in black and white.
Yeah, and this is one of the few places where you kind of draw that hard line, and you're very much clear about. I think there's an accuracy to, yes, there are benefits, but no more so than many other inversions. And so as someone that still practices headstand, however, I rarely teach it in a group class because, and yet, you know, I still find myself feeling some sort of external pressure that if you don't have headstand incorporated into your practice or into your teachings, that there must be something wrong with you. You must not be practicing real yoga. And so apologies, you may hear the train coming through here in just a moment. But I just appreciate that you don't just say no because I said no. You go into detail of explaining it, and then you follow that up with, please continue to practice headstand if it's something that's important to you, but just be very clear as to why you're practicing it. And so I just want to thank you for that, you know, that piece. And in no way, shape, or form are you, I don't get a sense that you're shaming teachers that do teach it. But it's, again, you very gracefully put this in writing in such a way that even someone that is maybe arbitrarily teaching it might take a step back and say, Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, people with strong, young, fit, healthy bodies who can do really extraordinary things with them is amazing. You know, that's an amazing facet of yoga, that you know, some people can do the most incredible things with their bodies. It is not a measure of your enlightenment or your spiritual achievement. And it's not a measure of how fit or healthy you will be in later life if you stand on your head all the time. And I, you know, so I don't ever want to stop anyone from doing it, but I do think we need to be aware that that yoga's for life, not just for your mid-20s. And it's never, I don't think it's ever too early to start cultivating a practice that's going to last that's going to adapt with you through your whole life, right? And some of these more kind of demanding on the body postures are not something you want to be doing like super regularly for 20 or 30 years.
Absolutely. One more pose that I do want to kind of bring attention to is, you know, you have now having a better understanding of how you kind of lay the book out in the order in which you might do a practice. So you have a section on the squat, and you have titled it The Squat. And I appreciate that. What maybe here at Old Town Yoga Studio, we might call it malasana, even though it's not done in a traditional fashion with the feet together but I love that you start this out with squatting is a basic human movement that has become critically endangered by our chair-centric existence. And so almost on the flip side of thinking of headstand, you know, you very kindly kind of say, you should be doing this one as much as possible whenever you can. And in my line of work with occupational health that I do outside of yoga, it's true. I mean, this sitting that we're doing is absolutely wrecking us. And so I just appreciate this. So can you talk to us a little bit more about, you know, how you gracefully weave squat into the book?
Yeah. So yeah, I love squat, but I think one of the things that I wanted to bring out in the book is that, like, the squat, so everybody talks about headstand and lotus and all of these complicated poses, but the squats are super challenging for a whole lot of people, and it's because we don't do it. You know, if you squat from childhood, then it's very comfortable. And actually in cultures where chairs are less universal, people squat. I grew up in Kenya in Africa, and that's how people wait for the bus, squat down. In India, it's how you milk a cow. You know, it's a very normal human thing to do. But I think because of that, because people know that, they can feel really bad about not being able to do it. So one thing that I discovered while I was researching the book, which I loved, was this very ancient yoga text, which had a bunch of different squatting positions in it. And it was, it says that, and you think, oh, well, you know, everybody in pre-modern India must have been really comfortable squatting on the ground. But the reason they prescribe it as a yoga pose was because, you know, certain Jain monks did this as their kind of penance, or like their tapas, their kind of, you know, squatting in this pose is meant to be super hard. So my kind of comfort I can offer to people is that yeah, when you're in a squat in a class and you feel like your legs are on fire and everybody else seems to be fine, that's perfectly normal. And actually, my suggestion really is that your squat shouldn't be static, that it should just move in all sorts of ways.
And that text that you referred to, that was an absolute new text for me. You know, I had never been exposed to that. And I believe what you're referring to is the Yoga Shastra. And
it's Hamachandra, yeah.
Yeah, and the milking pose and the, you know, the different things, but that's from the 11th century that, you know, is far more ancient than most of the texts that we might refer to. And so that was very eye-opening to me, and also kind of confirming to, I joke with my students, there's never going to be a class with me that we don't do this particular shape. And it's going to feel anywhere along the spectrum of luxurious to absolutely horrifying, depending on your anatomy and what your day-to-day life and your life, the history of your life has looked like.
So I can highly recommend a book that I relied on very heavily for the research of the book. It's called Roots of Yoga, and it's fairly recent, but it's the product of a decade or more of work by two yoga academics, translating these kind of slightly more obscure texts from the 9th century onwards, and it's just beautifully done. The translations are great, and it builds up this very multifaceted picture of where Hatha Yoga came from. So it's James Mallinson and Mark Singleton are the two people who've done it, and it was
Roots of Yoga.
Roots of Yoga, it's called, and it's published about 5 years ago. So if any of my fellow yoga nerds out there are interested in reading about lots of mad sounding postures that are lost in the mists of time, then that's the book for you.
Oh, so you know, I wonder, are there poses that you did place in this book that rise above the others? You know, are there ones that, even though you shouldn't have favorites, what were your favorite to write about?
Well, so there's a few. So one thing that I confess in the book, so I guess I can say it here because it's not a secret anymore, is that my favorite bit of a yoga class isn't a kind of peak pose or some show-offy thing. It's actually the warm-up, because I just love that process of kind of winding into the class. And in the book I compare it to kind of just sliding into the water, like sliding into a lovely cool pool on a hot day. Like you're sort of transitioning from one element to another. And I love the sort of repetitive, gentle movements that go into my warm-up anyway. So what looks to other people like just rolling around on the floor, and that I continue to insist is yoga, is my favorite thing. But I think in terms of actual poses, I mean, I love some of the really kind of flamboyant balletic ones. Like I love a warrior two or a Natarajassana, like a big kind of bold standing pose. But then also a child's pose is really kind of fundamental for me. That sort of process of kind of cocooning your heart and you know, creating this kind of safe space that you can kind of come back to during your practice. I think it's really precious.
And you actually utilize child's pose to pull in the 8 limbs of yoga, and you describe child's pose as being that ultimate place of pratyahara, you know, that kind of bridge, so to speak, from the one side of the 8 limbs into those more introspective things. So I really appreciated that, and that is toward the end of the book that, you know, you described that, but it absolutely resonated to think of child's pose as being that place of pratyahara. But you also describe your son and when you played hide and seek with him. So if you don't mind, just an overview of that. And I actually shared this with my class that I taught right before we met today, because I love it so.
So I'll read it actually. So when my son was very young, he would sometimes adopt this position, I mean child's pose, during a game of hide and seek, pulling his clothes up over his head to make it dark. And on the basis of, if I can't see you, you can't see me, this is a totally legitimate hiding place for a 2-year-old, even if to an untrained eye, he's quite hard to miss on full display in the middle of the living room floor in Spider-Man pajamas. But it's really difficult not to play along. I never did find him when he did this, so the ploy worked. There's something slightly magical about disappearing into child's pose. It sends a very clear do not disturb signal to the world at large. And for most of us, although by no means all, it feels safe to rest here, withdrawn, a little regressed in your tortoise shell.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you make it feel very real. And at times when I teach, I will encourage people to close their eyes, even if they can't come into that shape of child's pose. There's something about this idea that if I can't see, you can't see me.
Yeah.
And maybe take some of that that feeling of judgment or self-consciousness away. So, and then
I do think that one of the most important things that I learned through yoga was this this idea of finding this kind of lotus space inside your heart, like finding somewhere inside yourself that you can kind of draw yourself into, that's sort of infinitely small and infinitely large and kind of contains multitudes. And I feel like, yeah, those poses that allow you to be very interior and very kind of introverted, I find really necessary. You know, we're so busy. We have this kind of epidemic of action and stuff and talking, and actually resting is a really radical thing to do. And that kind of insistence that yoga allows us to have on the importance of coming into that space inside, I think is one of the most important things that it does for me anyway.
And that kind of comes back to that theme that I think you've weaved throughout the book, of that steadiness and ease and the balance between the two. And one final thought is, in a world where I feel like in yoga land, and you refer to this term of yoga land, where it is almost implied that we acknowledge the light and the positivity and the love and pay no mind to, the more dark aspects of life and hashtag good vibes only. You reference this in the book. You say it isn't all light and love in yoga land. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that's the whole good vibes only thing. Really turns me off, and I think that I have a lot of sympathy for it, because it's lovely to create a space that's super positive, but it's also very excluding for a lot of people, and for people who are aware of the less positive sides of themselves and of the world and of their loved ones and so on. To ask them to come into a yoga space and leave all of that outside is like such a wasted opportunity, right? Because yoga is about kind of finding a place to integrate those things. And I talk about these opposites that we're trying to reconcile all the time. And it's not about choosing one over the other. It's not about choosing good vibes over ugliness or whatever the opposite is to you. It's about recognizing that it's two sides of the same coin, and you don't get to have one without the other. So I want people to be able to come home to themselves in a yoga class and not feel compelled to create a fake, shiny, love and light filled version of themselves.
Thank you so much, Lucy. In the interest of time and wanting one more reading from you, if you will offer that to us, I believe you are going to do a reading about lion's breath. And lion's breath is something that, it's interesting with the onset of COVID. When we did come back to those in-person classes, lion's breath was kind of the first thing to go for me. I did not feel like I could teach a breath work that had someone exposing, all of their mouth and their germs, and it was something I missed very much. It's got a special place in my heart and in my practice on particular days, oftentimes.
Well, that's where online classes come into their own, right? Everyone can do it in the privacy of their own sitting room.
Right. Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
Of course.
Us.
Let's see if I can share Amanda's beautiful drawing. Here we go. So this posture is sometimes called lion's breath because there's a forceful exhalation that's integral to its execution. Take a breath in to prepare, move the head and chest forward, sticking out your tongue forcefully and allowing your eyes to cross as you breathe out with a ha sound. Yes, from most objective standpoints, you do look ridiculous, but also you are ferocity personified, pure wrath, unencumbered by notions of morality or decorum. This is the same expression found on the faces of Aztec jaguar masks, Chinese dancing lions, and European cathedral gargoyles. It's an attitude that may well turn your enemies to stone. The Asiatic lion is ferocious, wild, dangerous, in fact, anything but ridiculous. And as in real life, so in myth. Take the fearsome Narasimha, whose name literally means man lion, with a human body and a lion's great maned head and claws. He's an avatar created by Vishnu in order to defeat the evil demon Hiranyakashipu by disemboweling him with its claw. Statues and paintings of Narasimha often depict the scene of Hiranyakashipu's death in grisly detail. The man lion's jaws gaping in a ferocious roar, the surprised demon bent backwards over his lap, his guts spooling out in a riot of scarlet. Sometimes Narasimha is even shown wearing the demon's intestines like a garland of flowers around his neck. And Narasimha has at least 9 other iconic guises, most of them equally terrifying. For example, there are sculptures of angry Narasimha, ferocious Narasimha, and Narasimha emitting the flames of wrath. But among all these fierce and forbidding personae, there's also yoga teacher Narasimha, seated in meditation, his eyes are closed, his teeth are hidden, and his mighty talons folded into a mudra signifying peace. Soon after I began my yoga teacher training course, I celebrated my 34th birthday, and the same friends who a year earlier had given me, say, bottles of champagne or fun vintage earrings turned up with herbal tea and teapots, tea strainers, tea cups. Altogether, I counted 8 separate tea-related gifts. It was as though everyone had got a memo that I definitely didn't send. I mean, I like herbal tea about as much as the next yoga teacher, but it's never been my thing in the way that someone might be into plane spotting or collecting China tortoises. It's just something I drink a few times a week. But in the minds of my friends, a sort of panicked gifting short circuit was occurring. Yoga teacher training equals overnight interest in herbal tea. A yoga teacher, they were suggesting, is a person whose most intense celebratory pleasure is a nice cup of chamomile and spearmint. Me, I miss the champagne. I fully understand the expectation that every yoga teacher should be a shining example of physical and moral fitness. I still feel a little shocked myself when I spot a yoga teacher sneaking a quick cigarette on their way to the studio. We feel compelled to hide our bad habits and even our injuries, especially those related to our yoga practice. We have to maintain the fiction that the teacher is winning on all fronts, that yoga does indeed confer a glowing superiority in mind and body, or we risk undermining student confidence in the thing that we're selling. Perhaps it's bad for business, but speaking as a student, I prefer honesty over hypocrisy every time. I love the idea of lion-headed yoga teacher Narasimha, fierce and ridiculous, and always straddling the edges of things, trying to keep one foot in each camp. Demon slayer in the day job, Pussycat in the yoga studio. I'm sure I'd learned something from studying under a living saint, but to date, my most valuable teachers have been pragmatic and honest about the juggle of balancing the discipline of yoga with the demands of work and family life, and realistic about both the transformational powers of the practice and its limitations. They found humor and fellow feeling in the trying and the failing and the trying again. And they've shown me that getting past the performance and into the messy realness is the lion's share of the job. But that's what yoga asks of us again and again, to hold several conflicting truths in mind. It insists that we recognize the kinship of opposites, seeing soft and strong, minutely small and infinitely large, fierce and ridiculous, not as opposite ends of a spectrum, but conjoined faces of the same coin. And it insists that we enter into this both and experience, not just in the intellectual realm, but with our whole bodies. In a culture that prizes certainty, ambiguity can be a deeply uncomfortable space to occupy, but the rewards for learning to tolerate or even thrive in it are profound. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. So human first, yoga teacher second is often what I like to pride myself on. So
That's lovely.
I so appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that we are probably coming up on 9:30 p.m. your time there.
That's right, yeah.
With a 7
So
hour
I've had
time
some
difference.
herbal tea, I'll be fine.
Well, I mean, that's very important as a yoga teacher to be drinking your tea. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole, as unfortunately we're out of time here, but I have truly enjoyed talking with you.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Andrea. Thank you so much.
I was going to say, I almost didn't want to interrupt. I was like, I could listen to you read and you two chat forever, but we should probably let you get to bed. So real quick, just because we do have like just a minute left, I just want to see if either of our live attendees have any questions. We usually always do audience questions at the end, but since there's only 2 of you live, I know a lot of people are going to watch the recordings, but if you have a question, now is the time, because we've just got like a minute, so there's probably time for like 1 or 2 questions, and since there's 2 of you, I thought that would be perfect. So Teresa, did you have a question? Go for it.
Oh, this is terrible. I just want to know, when can I order the book? I can't wait to see it. The pictures are beautiful. I can't wait to dive in.
Thank you.
No, that's a fabulous question. So technically the book is not out yet, but Old Firehouse Books got a couple early copies for this event. So if you pop over to the store, we've got them in stock. You can grab one, or if you order online, oldfirehousebooks.com. I will go ahead and actually just throw the link in the chat for you. And you can just order it online. But yeah, if you pop into the store, we've got a couple special early preview copies. So you can grab it ahead of time.
Thank you so much. I will stop by.
Yeah, of course. We'll see you then. All right. Well, that was my big housekeeping thing at the end, is I always remind people they can buy the book. So I already did that. So I just want to say thank you to our 2 live attendees, and to anybody who is watching the recording. We couldn't do events like this without an audience. So thank you so much for registering. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for being here and supporting both your local independent bookstore and your local yoga studio. We super appreciate Old Town Yoga. Thank you so much for partnering with us for this one. Andrea, thank you for your absolutely wonderful interview questions. It was a joy to listen to you. And Lucy, thank you so much for sharing your book with us. Thank you so much for being here so late at night.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm thrilled. Thank you so much.
All right, and I think that's it. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good night.
Have a good night.
Bye. Good night.